So, so basically, I did a little research on the internet, and this was out there for free. And there's a link to also a paper on reading philosophy that you'll see it at the end of this if you scroll down to the end. But I thought I would go through this because it does a good job of presenting the essentials without asking you to buy a $50 book to get them, okay? But, you know, it can only help you if you buy them. Again, all the particulars on that are in the general, what's called the capstone syllabus. It's the other syllabus there in Blackboard. But this, you can see, was given by Harvard College, was issued to its philosophy, introductory philosophy students. Now, first of all, you know, when we looked at philosophy, we said that philosophy has been concerned with big questions that can't be answered by the scientific method. And you see some of them referred to. I mean, hopefully some people have at least read over this. In the first paragraph, like, how should we live? We saw Socrates was really concerned with that. What is a good life for a human being? Right? A very big question. Is there free will? Do human beings make genuinely free choices? And usually it's qualified. Do we have enough free will for moral responsibility for our choices? How do we know, or can we know anything? What is truth? Now, if you think about this, these are really huge questions that philosophers have been arguing about almost since the very start of philosophy. And they're too big even to cover in a book, much less to cover in a 6-page paper or a 3.5-page or a 3-page test essay. So you'll see soon that very often what you're going to be asked to do is something that's far narrower in scope than these big questions. But as I said, philosophers disagree a lot on what philosophy is and what it ought to be about, as well as they do differ on a concrete topic like, do we have free will? But you'll see the first highlighting I've done. This is my highlighting. There's some other things I could highlight, but it's like, God, you know, don't throw something up that if I click on it the wrong way, you know, means it's going to restart the computer when I'm in front of a class and recording. Okay. One thing you want to see is when we're asking you to write an essay in philosophy or a term paper, this is not a Marty Bass interview. Marty Bass is a local TV reporter. You know, I was once interviewed by him on something, and the point is, no matter what I said, I mean, he wasn't going to challenge it much. You know, whatever you say goes in an interview. What philosophers agree on is that merely expressing one's personal opinion on controversial topics like these is not doing philosophy. we are looking for your opinion in an essay, but we're looking for how well you support it. So it says, your answer should be supported by clear, logically structured arguments. Now, let me qualify that. How many of you have taken one of our logic or critical thinking courses? Okay, most people don't. Most people take that later if they're interested. The thing is, I know that I don't presuppose more knowledge of logic than somebody is going to have. When we ask you to discuss something or to evaluate an argument or to argue for something yourself, we're looking for you to use your common sense and argue in ordinary language, right? Okay. You will see some of my handouts and some of the things we read might have arguments summarized in a very technical way. Here's premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion. The skills, or to develop enough skills to be able to do that well, takes a lot more training in logic than you get even in a first-year logic course. We're not looking for you to do that when we ask you to do things like summarize arguments, but we are asking you to try to understand it as best you can and rephrase things. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. So while philosophers are motivated by the big questions, very often somebody who writes an article or even a book in philosophy is focusing on a narrower area. When would it be morally permissible to push someone into a path of a speeding trolley? What is a cause? How do I know that I have hands? Is there an external world? Now, on structuring a philosophy paper, usually, if your professor has done his work, you're not going to get a question like, what is truth? Can we know anything for certain? I mean, not one of these huge questions. Well, you can look at what the essays, what the prompts are, and judge that one for yourself. At any rate, note, under structuring a philosophy paper, it says philosophy assignments generally ask you to consider some thesis or argument, often a thesis or argument that has been presented by another philosopher. As we said before, one of the ways we're going to get you to think about things philosophically is to try to follow in the steps of other people who have tried to think carefully and clearly and deeply about some of these important questions, namely some of the people who we're going to cover and are in your textbook. So a thesis then is a claim somebody makes that can be true or false, one that you can either agree with or challenge. Now, it says you might be asked to do one or more of the following. Now, I did not highlight this laundry list, but you'll find that many of the questions ask you to do one or more of these things. Given this thesis or argument, and I'm going to read through this quickly, you might be asked to do one or more of the following. Explain it. Just explain the thesis. Offer an argument in support of it. Try to agree with it. offer an objection to it. More often than not, that's what you're going to be asked to do. Defend against an objection to it or evaluate arguments for and against it. So usually an essay prompt or a philosophy paper is going to ask you to do, one or two of these things. And most often it's going to be connected with evaluating some position someone else takes, as a way to try to get your own thinking on a topic clearer. So, okay, now again, this is out there along with the highlighted version. So how do you start a paper? Well, you think about the assignment, and the first task you've got is to decide, well, okay, where do I come down on this? Here, there's an example paper assignment given under good writing example. In boldface, you'll see it there. Jen is an imaginary philosophy student, and Smith is an imaginary philosopher, who supposedly has come up with an argument against the claim that we as humans have genuine free will, right? And so presumably this philosopher would have been covered in class. So the assignment to the students is evaluate Smith's argument for the claim that people lack free will. Now notice how much narrower that is from the big question, do humans have free will? Right? Here, you're not even asked to give your own opinion on whether humans have free will directly. You're saying, well, here's this philosopher Smith who has taken a particular position on it and advanced an argument. So you're not even looking at all the arguments that could be advanced against our having free will. But the focus is, here's this one philosopher who has tried to argue against free will. What do you think of Smith, that philosopher's argument? Okay. Now, so this is why it's not good to, do this in the last minute the night before. Because to write a really decent, well-structured and well-organized paper takes some pre-planning, some forethought. So she's trying to say, well, where do I come down on this? If there's something wrong with his argument, what is it? And she does think, Jen, our imaginary student, does think Smith's argument does not work. Now, honestly, just between you and me, we're not going to let the people at Harvard know this, but when they wrote this handout, I wish they would have picked a less technical objection. One of the things that can cause an argument not to work, to go wrong, is if the person advancing the argument uses the same word or key phrase in the argument with two different meanings. We call that a fallacy of ambiguity. And frequently, if it's a key word or term, the upshot of that will be that the argument doesn't work because the conclusion they're trying to get you to buy is not supported by the premises, because you meant one thing by that word in the premises and another thing in the conclusion. Now, there is a little quickie review of some basic logical fallacies in this handout. But again, so what she does is, when she says Smith's argument ultimately fails because it trades on an ambiguity, she's saying Smith is using a keyword or phrase in his argument with two different meanings, and as a consequence, the argument does not work. So she formulates her thesis, and you want to present this in the introduction to your paper or early on in your essay. Note she says, in this paper, I will refute Smith's argument against the existence of free will by showing that it trades on an ambiguity. And I'll remind you of this at the end. It's not a bad thing in a philosophy paper to write it in the first person. Okay? I don't care, what your English professor said. Don't write a thesis statement that says, the writer of this paper thinks Smith's argument fails because it trades on an ambiguity. Just say, I think it fails. There's nothing wrong with doing that. In philosophy, we use the first person a lot more, and it's accepted even at the highest levels. And it goes on later, the handout to explain that. Okay, so you formulated a thesis sentence, you think you know what's wrong. If you're going to use a word that's like a specific word in philosophy, you might want to explain it or define it. That frequently is a good thing to do. Now, in a short test essay, this is probably irrelevant, but sometimes, remember, who's your audience here? Well, it's not Professor Victor Morawski. In the real world, it is, all right? But the way you're writing this essay is you're not sending an email or a formal letter to a fellow philosophy professor where a lot of stuff is simply assumed because we both have a professional background in the subject. And you're not writing to somebody who already knows the background. As one of my graduate school professors used to say in his handout, your target person, your target audience, is somebody who, on the one hand, is intelligent. In other words, you're assuming that you're writing to somebody who can basically understand the issue you're discussing, but at the same time is ignorant. That is, ignorant of the particular issue, the particular topic, and in other words, you're writing to someone who you assume needs to be brought up to speed. But remember, you're also doing this. Now, in a journal, frequently you want to bring readers up to speed because somebody who's a professional may be familiar with a lot of other things in philosophy, but not the specific area that your article's on. But you're also trying to do something else, and sometimes students lose sight of this. You're trying to demonstrate to your instructor, who in this case is me, that you've done your homework, you've done some research, you understand what you're writing on. One thing I used to say is if your test essay or your term paper is something you could have written without even taking this course or before you ever took it, then that should really throw up a red flag. Because it means that you haven't demonstrated that you've learned anything in the course or anything about the topic in the essay you've written. if it's an essay that somebody could have written without taking the course at all. Okay, so how do you bring somebody up to speed? Well, look at the next section. So, if necessary, motivate your thesis. In other words, you don't have to motivate Professor Murawski. He's already motivated on those issues. But your imaginary reader, like take the issue of free will. One of the ways I'm going to try to motivate you all when we study that later on is that the issue of whether or not we have free will necessarily connects up with the issue of personal moral responsibility for our actions. In other words, if we really don't make any free choices, how can we be held responsible for the choices that we do make? So trying to figure out whether we genuinely make free choices hooks up with the notion of whether or not we are morally and even later legally responsible for those choices. So that's one way, an example of trying to motivate somebody on an issue, trying to explain why it's important to look into it. If necessary, explain the argument you will be critiquing. This is important. It's a very good thing to do, even in a short test essay. To try to explain and bring somebody up to speed, because it again lets the professor who's grading your essay know that this person has done some reading. They're not just BSing their way through this test question. They understand what they're talking about here. So if your assignment, then you'll need to explain the argument before presenting your critique of it. So don't just jump into what you think is wrong with it without first showing what the it is. What is the argument? And in this case, if you're supposed to critique Smith's argument, you want to summarize, well, what was the argument against free will that Smith was, this imaginary philosopher, was advancing? And they give you a little more of a discussion of that below. Now, note the other part in this paragraph I highlighted. This means that you should explain the argument in your own words and according to your own understanding of the steps involved in it. As I said, I'm not expecting you to lay it out the way you'll see in some of the handouts. Premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion. It takes a lot of training to be able to do that well. But you should be able to say, okay, let me try to understand how Smith is arguing against free will, and now how can I restate that in my own words? And after we look at there are some qualifications down below, and one thing to try to avoid is use direct quotes, if you use them at all, very sparingly. In other words, try to paraphrase things in your own words. Especially, if you're doing a 1.5 page essay, you don't want to throw in a quote that takes 1/3 of a page. That's not a good idea. Right, but try to stay away from direct quotes. Paraphrase things, but especially if you're asked to evaluate somebody's case for a position, try to summarize that as best you can in your own words. And don't try to sound pompous and erudite about it. Summarize it the way you would if you were having a dorm room discussion with your roommate, or your mother says, what did you all study in philosophy today? Oh, we studied Smith's argument. He was against free will, and here's basically why. Well, you're not going to get technical on your mother, right? Let's explain it. Okay. And note, now I'm not going to go through the poor writing example. You can look at it yourself. But note, one of the things he says the writer does wrong, and I see this time and time again. Okay. His conclusion, in this case, George's paper wasn't very good, right? George's conclusion was that Smith's argument, which he, George, had not explained, just jumped right into it. So you don't know, well, how much of Smith's argument did he really understand? And mentioned only at the end of the paper, right? So I had some. Okay, here's a center line you gotta try to walk. I told you at the beginning, this a paper in philosophy is not an interview where all we're asking for you to do, like a dorm room, like a bowl session, is just, what's your opinion on this topic? But we're asking you to defend it. But on the other side, if you're, if the assignment, like the one above, is to weigh in yourself on whether you think Smith's argument is a good argument or a bad argument, you're expected in the paper to take a position on it, one way or another. And again, my grading of a paper like that wouldn't matter what position you took. It's how well do you support the position you did take. So you don't want, I had some did 2 online critical thinking, elementary logic classes this summer at another institution, CCBC. Had some really bright people in there. But I get people who write this decent term paper. Well, it could be held on this question that X, but on the other hand, other people could argue against it, saying Y, but also, in addition, it's possible to argue for it, saying Z, but some people argue. In other words, these people were told to take, not be jotting little notes down. Yes, but what do you think about this position that people can take? Where is your, no doubt, if George left stating a thesis to the very end, if somebody is trying to grade his paper and they're saying, well, where does he stand on it? Is he ever going to take a position on it? He was supposed to. That was part of the assignment. Not just to say, well, it can be argued this way, it can be argued that way, but what do you think of Smith's argument? So, so you want to, weigh in and give your own position. So in other words, it's not just giving your own thoughts on a subject, but on the other hand, it's not avoiding giving your own thoughts if that's what the assignment calls for. Now, make an argument to support your thesis. In other words, if your thesis is that Smith's argument doesn't work. Now, and here's where some pre-planning, again, not only pre-planning, you might write out your thesis statement on a piece of paper, notebook paper, 3 or 4 times, scratch out some stuff, till you get it where you think it's clear and concise and says what you want to say before you type it in. But if you're just, trying to get it in and you're starting the paper at 9 o'clock at night, the night before it's due, can't do a lot of that. But again, if you're arguing against somebody, it's better not to take the shotgun approach, I'm just going to throw some stuff up against the wall to see what sticks. But if you're writing out, okay, what I think is wrong with Smith's argument is A, but the problem might be also B and C. Suppose you've written down some reasons against the position that you're supposed to be criticizing. What you ought to do, it says, it will almost always be more effective to use a single argument and make it as compelling as you can than to use more than one argument supported less comprehensively. So avoid taking a shotgun approach then. In other words, if you can write down some things that you think are wrong with Smith, suppose one of them says, but I think what really kills his argument is this ambiguity he has in the notion of, I think it's free choice or freedom. Yeah, free. In other words, let's jump down to it. You get her good writing example, and she says, as I have shown clearly in my reconstruction of Smith's argument, we assume that she has done this, right? The word free, as in free will, as appears in Smith's first premise, and she has already given that, must be interpreted from the word free as it appears in his third premise. In other words, one meaning is uncaused, that free actions have no cause whatsoever. And the other meaning is that free actions are caused, but the free actions are the ones that are unforced, uncoerced by external forces. Now, we're going to look at this view is called compatibilism. But do you see what we're saying is try to pick the best case you can give. Okay, so I'm recording this because a lot. Now, note I underline this because they state it smallly and they put it in big letters. If you use a claim that your reader might find doubtful, then you must try to give the reader convincing reasons for accepting it. A lot of the comments I make, and folks, there is somebody who I just absolutely will not give a break to when it comes to judging that person's writing. I won't let them get away with anything. I will come down on them for every little thing. And that person is not any of you. That person is me when I'm rereading something I've written. And I'm sure most of your professors would say the same thing. There's no way I'm going to be anywhere near as hard on one of you as I am on myself when I'm rereading and editing something I've written. Okay, but in a philosophy paper, if you're making a claim, you should try to back it up with reasons and don't just make a lot of claims without any support to them, and it's something to learn, Okay, so let me jump down. Now, here's another thing. One of the things we're thinking about vis-a-vis North Korea is whether or not to make a military preemptive strike, right? We were thinking about whether to do that with Iran There was a time when Israel did it with one of Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactors years ago. What's a preemptive strike? Well, you hit them before they have the capacity to hit you. Well, one of the things that's often done, especially in journal articles or in books, but also in a longer paper, probably not, and they even mention this, except for the very shortest assignments, like 3 double-spaced pages or less. What you want to do is, after you've made your case, in order to strengthen your argument, anticipate and answer objections to it. In other words, do a preemptive strike. Think, now, okay, how might somebody take the opposite position of the position I'm taking in this paper? And why would they be wrong in criticizing the position I'm taking in this paper? In other words, you anticipate possible objections and you try to knock them down before anybody raises them. Now, again, in a 1.5 to 3 page test paper, you don't have space for that. But in a 7 or 8 page paper, you might,
So you're asking us to give a rebuttal on what you think that somebody might give, and then you want us to dishonor that rebuttal with our own answer to the question.
Yeah, exactly. Say, well, okay, this is how somebody might object to the position I've taken here, but this is why I think they would be wrong in doing so. So it's a way of shoring up and nailing down your own position even better by saying, look, even some of these possible objections that somebody might take to it don't work, and here's why. Or you focus on one or two. Again, I wouldn't expect you to have space to do that in a test essay, but possibly in your paper. You might at least think about that as an option. So how to get it done, I didn't go over this. You ought to read this. It warns you against trying to write it from scratch, from beginning to end. When I'm trying to write something, I try to do it over a space of time. One thing I was taught in English composition is, first of all, the cliche that there's no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. But if you don't leave yourself enough time to edit and rewrite what you've said, because you're doing it starting your paper at 9 o'clock the night before, then it probably is not going to be anywhere nearly as good an effort as you could have made had you started earlier. Plus, when you're editing your own writing, one suggestion that we all follow is it's frequently good to let the writing get cold, to let a day or two go by and come to it with a different mindset than you had when you wrote it. And it's easier sometimes to pick out things that you could have said better, than to just try to do it immediately after you wrote it. That's what we mean by letting it get cold, letting a day or two go by before you come to it again. And so that obviously presupposes, not doing it, as an all-nighter the night before, right? So I'll let you read that because that's a good condensed way. Now here's as I said, a quickie logic course. Again, I'm not presupposing that you're able to summarize an argument in the kind of formal way you'll see in some of the things we read in some of my handouts. As I said, it takes a lot of practice to be able to do that, even much more than you usually get in a good logic course. But, you know, if you're trying to summarize somebody's argument, do it in your own. So here are just some things to keep in mind. Again, avoid direct quotes. If you need a quote, quote very sparingly. And you know, in your term paper, we're going to expect MLA citations. Now, with some of the test essays, it's kind of understood that you're, you know, writing on stuff that's in your own text. But we'll look at that more often. And as I said before, it is far more acceptable in philosophy. In fact, it's even advisable to write in the first person. Phrases such as, I will use the term realist to mean, are useful in clarifying your use of concepts and terminology. So if you were taught to write your lab report saying, the lab technician first mixed the two chemicals, and then the technician observed that, no, I mixed the damn chemicals and I observed it. In other words, you're giving your own opinion, folks. It is very acceptable to do it in the first person. In fact, it's advisable to do it. So now, right, it might be that you've got other situations where they really prefer the third person and the passive voice. And yeah, try to write in the active voice too. I mean, the passive voice, they love it in the sciences, you know. The observation was then carried out by the lab technicians, and in carrying out it, they observed that, you know, in other words, in the passive voice, nobody ever does anything, you know. Okay, so hopefully this will help you at least write a better essay, you know, and, you know, if you read this, now look, on at the end of this, note the same author, Jim Pryor. Again, I said this is not mine. This is from Harvard. Has his own site, and he's got a paper on there called Guidelines on Reading Philosophy. You know, and you know, sometimes you'll notice, and I'll just say this in the last thing quickly. You'll notice that the reading assignments I give you are very often not anywhere near as long as what you might get in English literature, where you got to read 50 pages of that novel tonight, but Murawski has assigned 3 to 5 pages of your text. Well, yeah, but that's because with the reasoning and argumentation going on in philosophy, it may take you as long to slog through 3 to 5 pages, you know, of something in Solomon as it does, you know, to read 40 or 50 pages of that novel, you know. So, but he does give you some guidelines on reading philosophy, and a lot of what you're doing in reading philosophy is simply reversing the process you just saw. Instead of deciding what is my thesis, you're saying, well, what is the author's central thesis? What are they trying to establish? And then instead of saying, well, what arguments am I going to construct to support my position, you're saying, well, what are the reasons, what are the arguments that this author uses to support the position they're making in it, you know. But he gives you much more than that in that guideline. So that's something you might want to take a look at on Jim Pryor's own website. Okay, thank you very much, and we're going to go on in the syllabus. And again, sign the roll if it passed you. Make sure you got your signature down on it before you leave, and have a good day.
I have a question. So, everything that you just recorded is going to be on Blackboard?
Well, the document I just went through is already